Liam Reeves had trudged through countless corridors of starships and starbases during his years of service in Earthfleet, but the moment he stepped into Helios Gateway's medical sector, he couldn't shake the unusual sense of apprehension radiating from every muscle. In the station's bustling reception area, voices of different species mixed with the constant hum of fluorescent lights and the background drone of power generators. Despite his broad shoulders and a stride that typically commanded respect, Liam's posture was stiff and sweat dampened the neckline of his uniform. He blamed it on the throbbing ache in his upper back, a persistent nagging knot in the muscle that clenched every time he took a deep breath. Ordinarily, such pain would be an annoyance, something quickly patched up by a field medic, but this time, the ache refused to subside no matter how many standard painkillers he took or how many self-administered physiotherapy techniques he attempted. At the suggestion of an insistent medical officer, he'd finally relented and scheduled an appointment with a newly arrived specialist, rumored to be from a world called Lilia. He hadn't expected that the recommended therapist would not only have 4 arms, but a mysterious background to match. He sat on an uncomfortably rigid bench in the waiting area, refusing to let the pain show on his face. A few chairs away, a pair of Andorians conversed in hushed tones, their antennae twitching as they stole occasional glances in his direction. Across from him, a reptilian-looking Glazorian clutched a small container of spores, presumably waiting for some botanical therapy. The diversity was typical of Helios Gateway, an interspecies stronghold at the edge of known space. The station functioned as a trade post and a diplomatic nexus, and it had recently seen a surge in high-lipped security measures after a rumor about infiltration attempts by the Orion Syndicate. Liam closed his eyes and pressed a palm against his forehead. Could a muscle cramp really overshadow everything else that was going on? He considered ignoring the appointment altogether and shuffling back to his quarters with a bottle of analgesics, but the pain in his shoulder flared at just that moment, as if mocking the thought. Grudgingly, he stayed. The nurse, an older man from Earth with a pragmatic expression, stepped out from behind the triage desk. "Lieutenant Reeves?" Liam rose. "That's me." He straightened his uniform and tried to smile. The attempt dissolved into a grimace as a sting tore down his spine. "Apologies. A bit sore. Dr. Terrace will see you now. She has a private chamber at the end of the hall. Treatment Bay 7. The nurse's tone seemed almost amused, and Liam lifted a brow. He nodded in thanks, then walked down the hallway, passing doors behind which various hums of diagnostic equipment could be heard. Each step felt like treading on gravel made of glass, the subtle jolt reverberating in his back. He found himself standing outside a door labeled Treatment Bay 7. A gentle chime sounded when it scanned his ID. The door slid open with a whisper of hydraulics, revealing a surprisingly spacious room bathed in soft, diffuse lighting rather than the harsh fluorescence he was used to. Tall shelves housed instruments and scanning devices, many of them alien in design. A faint, calming aroma, a mix of something reminiscent of cinnamon and ozone, lingered in the air. He was just beginning to relax at the pleasant atmosphere when he noticed the figure near the far corner. She stood at a small workstation, angled slightly away from him, and her posture was poised and alert. Violet skin, luminescent in the room's glow, stretched over a sleek humanoid form. Long, silvery hair cascaded down her back in a series of graceful waves, and she wore a fitted garment of dark material that signified medical authority, but in a decidedly non-human cut. The detail that made Liam pause was the fact that she had 4 arms, each engaged in a different activity with precise coordination. One hand tapped quickly at a screen, another adjusted the volume on a piece of scanning equipment, and the remaining 2 prepared tools on a metallic tray. It was mesmerizing. He cleared his throat, and she turned with a welcoming smile. "Lieutenant Reeves?" she asked. Her voice was soft and melodic, and the universal translator earpiece Liam wore required almost no adjustment. "I'm Dr. Nara Terrace." He couldn't help the flicker of surprise that registered in his eyes. It was one thing to know intellectually that Helios Gateway housed all sorts of species. It was quite another to stand in the same room with a Lelian whose very physiology defied human norms. "Yes, I am. Nice to meet you." He tried to manage his expression. "I'm told you're the best in musculoskeletal therapy." Her lips curved into a professional smile. "I'm well versed in rehabilitative treatments, yes. And humans generally respond well to Leylian techniques." One of her arms gestured politely to an adjustable table set at an incline in the center of the room. "Let's see what's troubling you." He approached the table, unzipping the top of his uniform to expose the broad surface of his upper back. Even the simplest motion caused a pang that made him grit his teeth. Nera stepped forward, notepad in hand, though it was a holographic display that flickered with her inputs. "Where precisely is the pain localized?" "Right side, just under the shoulder blade," Liam replied, lying prone on the table once it whirred into position. "Feels like something is locked up. Hasn't let go for a day or two." She nodded. One of her hands adjusted the lighting over the table, while another hovered a scanning tool over the affected region. Her third hand pressed gently against his shoulder blade, while the fourth manipulated a specialized stylus that projected a 3D image of his musculature. "You said you just returned from an escort mission in Orion space?" He allowed himself a wry laugh. "Yes, 18 hours in a combat harness. We had a run-in with the Orion Syndicate. They're making trouble again, or so it appears." "That would do it." Her tone was empathetic. "Stress combined with extended compression in your gear. Muscles can go into protective spasm." He managed to grunt as her pressing hand found a knot. "Yeah, I guess so." The release of tension was immediate and startling, and he almost forgot to keep up the conversation. "I appreciate your help. I tried standard analgesics, but they did nothing." "You probably need a more direct approach." She tapped her stylus. "Humans have wonderful healing capacities, but your body also holds stress in ways I find both fascinating and concerning." She leaned closer, her violet cheek near his line of sight. He caught her subtle scent again. It was oddly comforting. Then she moved all four arms to different positions along his back, shoulders, and upper spine, starting an intricate pattern of pressure and release. Liam had been to many therapists across the galaxy, but the feeling of four well-trained hands simultaneously working in concert on separate muscle groups was unlike anything he had experienced. He gave a quiet gasp of relief, feeling his entire back loosen. A surprising wave of warmth radiated through his torso, coaxing him to exhale in a long, soft breath. "Is that too intense?" she asked, easing the pressure slightly. "No," he admitted. "It's actually really good." He paused, a flash of curiosity flickering in his mind. "Do your people regularly go into medical fields? I can see how having four arms would be a serious advantage." She let out a musical laugh. "Many Leylians do excel in dexterity-based professions, yes, but we're not limited to that. I chose rehabilitative medicine because it suited certain aptitudes I developed. Perhaps I'll tell you about it another time." Their gentle exchange continued as she pressed along his back, addressing knots and thickened muscle bands with remarkable skill. She asked about his mission experiences, about human healing traditions, even about his personal stress levels. Soon, the tension in his shoulders and back subsided enough that he almost drifted off. Eventually, her voice drew him back. "Let me do one last scan," she said. A different scanning device passed over him, and the overhead hologram displayed a more detailed readout of his musculature, verifying that the inflamed tissue had relaxed. "I want to see if there's any residual microtear or nerve compression." He nodded, propping himself on one elbow and trying to ignore the mild twinge in his back. As the hologram settled, her expression shifted slightly. It was an almost imperceptible narrowing of the eyes, a subtle tension in her jawline. "Everything okay?" Liam asked, trying to read the data that was reversed from his angle. She hesitated only for a moment. Then her tone remained light, though he detected a thread of concern. "It's likely nothing. Maybe some slight swelling from repetitive strain. Let's keep an eye on it. The station has wonderful facilities, so if it persists or worsens, come see me again tomorrow, preferably earlier in the day." Though her expression had mostly returned to professional neutrality, he noticed the micro-expressions that typically told him something was off. He wasn't a professional in reading alien faces, but as a security officer he had developed a keen intuition for these things. Still, he decided not to press the issue just then. If it was urgent, she would have said something, or so he hoped. "All right," he said, easing himself off the table. "Thank you, Doctor." She offered him a small, reassuring smile. "We'll schedule another session soon." He tried to nod politely, ignoring the weird flutter of possibility in his gut. The relief from the therapy was tangible, yet some vague impression in her eyes stuck with him. He left the room, stepping back into the corridor. Lights flickered overhead, a subtle sign of the station's aging infrastructure, and a distant alarm or announcement droned in a far sector. Liam shook himself, trying to focus. He couldn't shake the sense that something more lurked behind the mild ache in his shoulder. That night he slept fitfully in his modest quarters. Hours before dawn cycle, he jolted awake to a stabbing spasm in the same spot where Nara had found the swelling. Grumbling under his breath, he sat up on the edge of the bed and fumbled for the lamp. The pain radiated out in a tingling path that prickled all the way down his arm. Through clenched teeth, he muttered curses at his luck. He wanted to shrug it off as nothing, but the intensity was building, and his instincts as a security officer told him to trust the signals of his body. Something unusual was happening. He rose, pulled on a plain t-shirt and uniform pants, then placed a direct call to the medical sector. No answer. Another wave of pain drilled into him, and he decided to rely on her offer. Nara had said he could come see her if anything felt off. With measured breaths, he headed out. The corridors were nearly deserted at this hour, the overhead lighting dialed to a faint nighttime glow. He noted the hiss of atmospheric controls, the soft clang of distant machinery. Helios Gateway, despite the variety of species, still adapted a somewhat human schedule, but a station never truly slept. He reached the door to Treatment Bay 7. It was locked. Cautiously, he placed a hand on the panel and keyed in an override request, hoping the system would patch him through. Instead, the door hissed open as though someone had already granted him access. He stepped in. The interior was dim. Gone was the warm, ambient lighting from earlier. Instead, a single overhead lamp cast shifting shadows on the floor. He heard the hum of scanning devices deeper in the room. Then, from behind a partition, Nara's voice rang out. "Lieutenant Reeves." He followed the sound and found her in a smaller adjoining lab space, dressed not in the fitted medical tunic but in a sleek sleeveless garment that bared her 4 slender arms. She was examining a holographic display of what looked like a scan of someone's musculoskeletal system. He realized with a start that it might be his own data from earlier. Next to her was an array of unfamiliar instruments, some glinting ominously. "I'm sorry to barge in," he said. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying not to appear too rattled by the setting. "But you said to come if anything got worse, and it's definitely worse." Her gaze flickered to the console. "It's fine. I'm glad you did." She took in a quick breath, reaching out gently with one of her hands to press a palm to the top of his shoulder. "You're in pain. Sit on that stool. Let me see what's going on." He lowered himself onto a nearby stool, feeling the jolt of pain run from neck to rib cage. She activated a scanning wand and ran it over the problem area. With each pass, her expression became more inscrutable, her lips set in a careful line. The readout on the console shifted into a complicated pattern. "What is it?" Liam asked, impatience creeping into his voice. "You look concerned." Nara took a measured breath. "I see a foreign object near your scapula. It's not large, maybe the size of a grain of rice, but it's embedded in muscle tissue. It's also radiating some kind of signal or energy pattern." He felt a chill run through him. "You're saying I have an implant? I never authorized anything like that. I suspect it was placed without your knowledge, likely during a fight or infiltration." She lifted the wand, turned to face him fully. "Have you been in any close combat scenarios recently? Or did your combat harness get breached? His mind went back to the Orion escort mission, the firefight along the trade routes. There was a moment he recalled, a burning slash through the plating near his back, alarms screaming in his helmet. The onboard medic had insisted it was nothing beyond superficial scorching. We had a skirmish, yes. The medic said the harness breach was minimal. She set the scanner down and pressed her violet lips in a grim line. The station has been on alert about infiltration attempts from the Orion Syndicate. They often use biotrackers to collect physiological data from high-value targets. If you were in that area, it's possible they managed to slip something into your muscle. Liam exhaled, tension knotting in his chest. This is more complicated than I expected. Can you remove it? I can try, she said, her upper left hand gesturing to a sealed tray of surgical implements. But if it's actively transmitting, then the people who placed it might already know your location. We have to be careful. She tapped the console, pulling up what looked like a station schematic. And there's another issue. If we do a standard extraction here, it could trigger an alarm in the device or some failsafe. Potentially, it might release a toxin or scramble your nerve signals. I'd prefer to do this in a more controlled environment. He let out a slow breath, reeling from the revelation. So what do we do? Her violet eyes met his. There was a quiet determination in them. We head to a private lab facility on the station that I keep off the main logs. I have the equipment to keep the device from sending an alarm out. But we have to move now. If the Syndicate is behind this, they won't just wait around. As if on cue, a station-wide alarm blared, the lights flashing red. Both of them started. Liam tapped the communicator on his wrist and heard a partial automated message. Security breach in docking sector. All non-essential personnel evacuate. Then static overtook the broadcast. Naren nodded grimly. They're already here. They slipped out of the medical bay into a corridor that was darkened except for emergency track lighting. The usual hum of station life had become an ominous hush, punctuated by the hiss of distant blasts or the clatter of footsteps. Liam tried to ignore the surge of heat pulsing from his shoulder. At every turn, Nara guided him with an uncanny confidence, using her top two arms to operate control panels and her lower two to keep a sidearm at the ready. The station's architecture seemed labyrinthine, but she navigated it as though she had studied every blueprint. Her swiftness was remarkable. He realized that her Lelian heritage likely gave her a level of grace few humans could match, especially under duress. They heard voices in a side passage, a tense exchange, and the clatter of metal. Liam motioned for Nara to stay back. He eased forward, peering around the corner. 3 figures dressed in black infiltration suits were planting a spherical device near a cluster of power conduits. In the flickering emergency lights, the insignia on their sleeves was faint but unmistakable. Orion Syndicate. Liam clenched his fists. He recognized the neural disruptors they carried, dangerous weapons that caused intense neurological damage. If they planted bombs or sabotage devices on Helios Gateway, the station would be crippled. Nara touched his arm lightly, gesturing that they should slip around. But as they tried to pivot away, one of the Syndicate infiltrators looked up, eyes narrowing behind a visor. "Intruders!" the infiltrator barked. Liam's adrenaline spiked. "Run!" he hissed to Nara. At the same time, he launched forward, tackling the nearest infiltrator. Pain erupted in his back, but he forced himself onward, wrestling the man's weapon arm away. Nara, quick as lightning, used 2 arms to knock aside the second infiltrator, while her other 2 pinned the third's weapon hand. The corridor filled with the crackle of disruptor fire. Sparks danced off the metal walls. In the chaos, Nara used a piece of medical equipment from her belt, a handheld sedation injector, to knock out the infiltrator grappling her. One infiltrator remained conscious, twisting under Liam's grip. "We have him," the man snarled into a comm device. "We found the tracker subject." Panic flared in Liam's mind as he realized the man was calling for backup. He drove a solid punch to the infiltrator's head, silencing him. But the damage was done. The Syndicate now knew his location for sure. He looked around, chest heaving. Nara was scanning the prone bodies, quickly checking vital signs. She rose, her face set in grim resolve. "They'll be here in minutes. That calls for a change of plans. My private lab is a floor down, but we need to get to a service lift across the next corridor. I can jam their communications from there." They sprinted down the corridor, the pounding of Liam's boots in sync with her lighter, sure-footed steps. The station's emergency lights flickered, occasionally bathing them in deep red, then plunging them back into shadows. They passed sealed blast doors and the anxious faces of station personnel hunkered in side rooms. The sense of looming violence grew more suffocating with every corner they turned. Finally, they reached the service lift. Nara overrode the lock with a rapid flurry of her forearms at the control panel. They slipped inside and the doors sealed with a hiss. She keyed in a secret code. The lift vibrated, descending into the sublevels. Liam exhaled, leaning on the wall and pressing a hand to his throbbing shoulder. "How did you know how to do that?" he asked, when he saw the complex sequence she'd entered. Obviously not standard station procedure. She gazed at him for a moment. "Because I'm not just a therapist. I served in Lelian Special Intelligence before I chose to defect. This station accepted me under certain terms, and I keep a lab here for my research." She paused. "I left because my government was developing the same kind of bio-trackers that Orion Syndicate uses. I couldn't be part of it." Her confession sank in. He realized that explained her combat reflexes, her comfort with infiltration routes, and her calm under fire. "So, you're a defector. That's quite the life story." Her expression was tinged with regret. "Yes, and I do want to help you. Though I realize my past might be reason for mistrust." He was silent for a moment, then he said, "I believe you. Right now, we need every advantage we can get." The lift jerked to a stop, and the doors parted onto a dimly lit corridor that smelled faintly of ozone. She led him to a sealed hatchway at the end which opened into a lab that felt more like a personal den than a standard medical facility. The lighting was subdued, warm. Shelves held real paper books, an oddity in this day and age. A few potted plants from distant worlds glowed softly in corners. A high-tech diagnostic table stood at the center, surrounded by advanced imaging equipment. It felt like a secret sanctuary. She activated a lock on the door behind them, then hurried to a console. "I'm jamming external signals," she said, her voice tense. "It'll cloak us from immediate detection for a short time, but once the syndicate figures out they've lost your signal, they'll start searching physically." Liam's heart hammered, partly from the chase, partly from the continuous pulse of agony in his shoulder. "So let's do this. Take this damn thing out of me." She nodded, motioning him to remove his shirt and lie face down on the diagnostic table. He complied, wincing as the motion inflamed his muscles. Her forearms moved quickly, each with a task. One administered a local anesthetic near the embedded device, another calibrated scanning software, the third readied a microsurgical tool, and the fourth adjusted the overhead lights. The synergy of her movements was uncanny, reminiscent of a well-trained surgical team condensed into one person. "This will hurt even with the anesthetic," she warned, pressing the tool against his skin. "But it's the fastest way. We have to sever its connections before it can detect tampering." He gritted his teeth, nodded. "Do it," she began. A sharp sting cut through the numbness. He felt the tool's vibrations resonating in the bone. He clenched his fists, forcing his breath to remain steady. It was an odd dance of pain and numbness as she meticulously excised filaments that had threaded into his tissue. His mind drifted to the day's events, the abruptness of it all. Yesterday he'd thought he was just dealing with a muscle cramp. Now he was in a hidden lab, trusting an alien defector to remove a bio-tracker from his body while criminals roamed the station. "You're doing fine," Nara whispered, her voice soothing. "Almost there." Her gaze flicked to a monitor, then back to his shoulder. Sweat beaded on her brow. He let out a strained chuckle. "You realize if I'd never had that muscle cramp, we might never have discovered the device." "In a twisted way, it was good fortune," she replied. Then she let out a triumphant sound. "I've got it." Carefully, she pulled out a tiny metallic sliver, no bigger than a pebble, glistening with fluid. He exhaled, relief flooding him. She placed the device in a small containment sphere that promptly bathed it in a neutralizing field. It pulsed ominously, as if protesting. She wasted no time injecting a regenerative solution into the wound and sealing it with a portable dermal laser. The combination of futuristic medical science and her own expertise meant that, although it would be sore, he would mostly be functional. He rose gingerly from the table, pressing a hand to the fresh patch of skin. "That thing was inside me." Nara nodded, retrieving a scanning wand. "Yes, and from these readings it wasn't just tracking your location, it was sampling your DNA and monitoring your body's stress responses in real time, likely to refine a targeted pathogen or weapon. The Syndicate must have big plans. That's disturbing," he muttered. "Well, at least it's out now. But we have a station to save, don't we?" She stepped close, her lower right hand resting on his arm. "Yes, but we'll also have to destroy that device. If they retrieve it, they can salvage the data or reuse it. We can't let that happen." He glanced into her eyes, the moment charged by more than just immediate danger. "I won't let them," he promised softly. It struck him then how easily they had slipped into a sort of intimacy. Maybe it was the adrenaline, the trust built under fire. Still, he felt an odd warmth stir between them, something that transcended species. A soft alarm chimed from the console. Nara hurried over, scanning the readout. "There are multiple life signs near the corridor outside. They're sweeping the area." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "We have to move. Now." She dashed to a panel on the far wall, sliding it aside to reveal a narrow passage that looked more akin to an abandoned conduit. "We can exit through here. It's an old service channel. I've used it before. It's not on official maps." Without hesitation, Liam followed her into the cramped corridor. He could barely stand upright, while she, slightly shorter and more lithe, navigated with careful grace. The walls were lined with old cables, some of which still hummed with residual power. The air was musty, thick with the metallic tang of neglected infrastructure. She led the way, occasionally checking a handheld scanner. Behind them, muffled footsteps echoed faintly, the infiltration team presumably searching for the missing device's signal. His mind churned through their next steps. They needed to neutralize the Syndicate threat before the station was sabotaged beyond repair. Perhaps they could link up with Helios Gateway's security detail, or gather allies among the station's diverse population. At a small intersection of conduits, they paused, hearing voices around the bend. Carefully, they peered through a grated vent, spotting a group of station engineers, their uniforms a kaleidoscope of species, cowering behind cargo crates. A pair of Syndicate operatives had them pinned. Liam gestured to Nara. If they helped the engineers, maybe they could form a plan together. He took a steadying breath, ignoring the lingering sting in his shoulder. With a nod, they coordinated the assault. Liam silently flipped open the vent, dropped into the corridor, and tackled the nearest operative. A yelp of surprise tore from the man's throat. The second operative swung around with a disruptor, but Nara's forearms disarmed him in a fluid motion that was almost beautiful to watch. Her limbs seemed to move in separate directions simultaneously, each with precise intent. Shaken but unharmed, the station engineers scrambled to their feet. One was an Andorian with teal skin. Another was a tall, wiry Vulcan. The third a stout human with grease marks on her cheeks. They all stared at Nara in amazement, having never seen a Lelian fight so expertly. "Lieutenant Reeves, Earthfleet." Liam introduced himself quietly, showing them his ID badge. "And this is Dr. Terrace. We're trying to stop these Syndicate infiltrators." The human engineer swallowed hard. "We were trying to lock down the maintenance hatches, but they cornered us." Nara surveyed them, then asked, "Do any of you know how to scramble or jam a short-range signal? We have an important piece of equipment we need to conceal." The Vulcan nodded calmly. "I specialize in communications. If you can give me about 5 minutes, I might rig a device to produce a false signal while jamming the real one." He lifted a battered toolbox. "May I?" Nara retrieved the containment sphere, holding the biotracker from a pouch. "We need to ensure they can't track or retrieve this." He studied the sphere and device intently. We can certainly attempt to scramble it, but you understand if they have more advanced trackers, it won't be a permanent solution. That's all we need, Liam said, scanning the corridor for more threats. Something to buy us time. As the Vulcan engineer set to work, the Andorian nodded to Liam. Security Chief Varus and some of our squad are regrouping near the environmental control room. They're planning a counterattack, but so far communications are patchy. We got word that some syndicate infiltration teams are planting explosives near critical systems. The entire station could be compromised if we don't stop them. Liam exchanged a glance with Nara. He recognized the urgency. All right, we'll jam the signal, then head to the environmental control room to coordinate with security. When the Vulcan finished rigging a small handheld scrambler, he handed it to Nara. This should mask the device's transmissions for now. They parted ways, Liam and Nara slipping back into the service channels to avoid direct confrontation. Adrenaline coursed through him as they navigated the station's underbelly. Each turn brought a new wave of tension. They heard distant gunfire, the panicked screams of frightened civilians. Helios Gateway, once a thriving hub of commerce and diplomacy, had devolved into a war zone. Eventually, they found themselves approaching the environmental control room. The sound of commotion bled into the corridor. Liam gestured for Nara to be on guard. Creeping forward, they spotted a half-dozen syndicate agents fiddling with large canisters near the air filtration system. If those were bombs or toxins, it could wipe out huge sections of the station. Liam grimaced. We can't let them sabotage the life support. That'll force the entire station to surrender. Nara scanned the area. No sign of friendly forces, but we can't wait. You go for the canisters, I'll distract them. Be careful, he murmured. Without hesitation, she moved. Two of her arms clung to a support beam, another readied her sidearm, and the last accessed a console that controlled the overhead lighting. Suddenly, the corridor lights flared and flickered. The infiltrators cursed, half-blinded, turning their weapons toward the disturbance. In the confusion, Liam lunged from the opposite side, tackling the first agent away from the canisters. They toppled over a control panel and he delivered a swift strike that knocked the man unconscious. Another agent swiveled, but Nara was already there, discharging a quick stun bolt. A skirmish erupted, brief and frenetic. Liam caught a disruptor blast across his upper arm, pain exploding, but he persevered, grabbing the infiltrator's wrist and twisting until the man dropped the weapon. Nara pinned the last agent with shocking agility, her forearms locking him in a hold that he couldn't hope to break. Moments later, the corridor fell quiet except for the heavy breathing of Liam and Nara. She helped him subdue the unconscious foes, ensuring none could cause further harm. His arm throbbed, the wound scorching. He sank against a railing, teeth clenched. "You're injured," she said, her voice strained with concern. He waved her off. "I'll manage." "Did we secure the canisters?" She hurried to check them, pressing buttons on a small handheld sensor. "They are set to disperse a sedative gas in lethal concentrations. Good thing we stopped them now." She paused. "We need to move them to a safe location, or at least remove their triggers." He nodded, stepping forward even though the pain in his arm was fresh. With a hiss of breath, he helped her disarm the sabotage devices. She gave him a quick injection to dull the pain, her skilled hands pressing a mild analgesic patch over the wound. He marveled again at her dedication. She was simultaneously a guardian and a healer. They were interrupted by a shout from farther down the corridor. "Commander Reeves!" He turned to see an Andorian security chief approaching with a small squad of armed officers. Relief washed over Liam, but only for a second. The Andorian's antennae twitched in suspicion at the sight of Nara and the subdued syndicate operatives. Then recognition lit his eyes. "We received partial intel that you were compromised, but it looks like you're the one saving the station." Liam gave a curt nod. "We found out I had a bio-tracker in my shoulder. Dr. Terrace removed it and we've been on the run. The syndicate's more coordinated than we thought." The security chief regarded Nara warily, then signaled his men to secure the corridor. "Commander, we're regrouping in the recreation sector. Civilians have taken shelter there, along with some medical staff. We plan to retake the command center next, but the syndicate holds key areas. We need your help." Nara reattached her sidearm. We're in. The sabotage devices here need to be locked down, though. We disarmed them, but I'm not sure for how long. The chief motioned to one of his subordinates, who moved to examine the canisters. We'll handle it. Commander, Doctor, come with us. We can plan a coordinated counterattack. The group headed through another warren of corridors until they reached the recreation sector, which had been converted into an impromptu base. Tables had been pushed together to form a central command station. Medical cots lined one wall, treating the wounded. Several species, humans, Andorians, Vulcans, and more, worked side by side, scanning station schematics, analyzing stolen syndicate data. The air was thick with tension, but also with a sense of unity. An older Trill wearing the uniform of a station director approached, relief flooding his spotted features. "Commander Reeves, I'm so glad you're all right. Word was that the Orion Syndicate specifically targeted you." Liam nodded. "They planted a device in me to track my location and gather my biological data, possibly to develop specialized weapons. Dr. Terrace extracted it." Nara lifted the small container in which the neutralized tracker remained. "I recommend we destroy it, but I also understand some might want to examine its design." A few scientists among the group practically salivated at the prospect of studying it. The station director rubbed his temples. "We'll examine it briefly, but it must be destroyed. The Syndicate has done enough damage." The plan to retake the command center was quickly laid out on a battered holomap. The infiltration team had taken over key control panels and locked out security protocols, preventing station forces from regaining authority. With the main communications network sabotaged, they needed a more direct approach. The Allies would strike in two coordinated teams, one assaulting the infiltration group from a flank corridor, the other unlocking essential system override. Liam found himself stepping up to organize the assault. He was used to leading squads, but not typically a ragtag band of station personnel and volunteers. Yet as he looked around, he realized how many species and backgrounds were represented, each bringing unique skills. Nara stood at his side, her forearms deftly tapping through different data screens as she assisted. They exchanged a meaningful glance. Since this all began, they'd been thrown together in crisis, each trusting the other with their life. That trust radiated now, fueling the strategy they were forming. While they prepared, Nara insisted on treating Liam's wound more thoroughly. She guided him behind a makeshift partition. With quick, practiced motions, she removed the patch, disinfected the burn, and applied a specialized regeneration salve. The sensation was cool and soothing. His breath caught slightly when one of her other arms gently pressed against his chest. He felt a warmth rush through him that had nothing to do with the salve. She paused, meeting his eyes. That same unspoken tension from earlier hung between them. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. If it weren't for you, I'd either still be trying to fix this muscle cramp or be in the Syndicate's custody." Her lips curved in a small smile. "And if it weren't for your directness, I might have stayed in the background, never revealing who I used to be or what I'm truly capable of. I'm glad we found each other." Her cheeks flushed a deeper violet hue, and then she cleared her throat. "But we should focus." He nodded, his pulse still a little high, stepping back into the main area. The tension of imminent battle overshadowed personal confessions for now. They had a station to save. When the time came for the final push, Liam led the first team through a series of old maintenance tunnels that circled behind the command center. Nara accompanied a second team that planned to breach from a lateral corridor. Because of her infiltration skills and knowledge of the station's hidden routes, she was the perfect guide. The plan was synchronized to the minute. They had to strike simultaneously, or the Syndicate could consolidate their defenses. The countdown beeped in Liam's earpiece. He took one final breath, signaled to his squad, and they surged forward. The command center corridor was guarded by at least 10 Syndicate agents, well armed. Laser fire erupted, scorching walls and sending sparks in arcs of light. Liam pressed himself behind a bulkhead, returning fire. He could hear shouts from the Syndicate, who realized they were being flanked by a second group. The station's forces were outnumbered, yet the Syndicate was caught in a pincer. Confusion set in among their ranks. Liam seized the moment, emerging from cover to deliver a volley of precise shots at their forward guards. 2 agents went down, the rest scrambling to reorganize. On the far side, he glimpsed Nara's lithe form weaving through a hail of gunfire. Her 4 arms gave her an eerie advantage. She fired with one hand while adjusting a console with another, simultaneously tossing a concussive device with a third. Her synergy was extraordinary, and even in the chaos, Liam felt a swell of admiration. Amidst the blasts, an Orion Syndicate officer bellowed a command, and 3 infiltrators fired on Liam's position. He ducked behind a chunk of torn plating, adrenaline hammering his senses. The corridor was quickly filling with smoke and swirling lights from jammed consoles. He risked a glance, saw that Nara and her sub-team had gained ground, and decided to push again. He rolled across the floor, ignoring the sting in his arm and the persistent ache in his back, coming up behind the nearest Syndicate operative. In a swift motion, he disarmed the man, jammed an elbow into his gut, then dropped him with a stun baton. Another swung around, neural disruptor sizzling. Liam jerked aside as searing pain grazed his ribs. Desperate, he swung the baton in an arc, connecting with the attacker's temple. Sparks flashed and the man collapsed. Breathing hard, Liam looked for Nara. The station's forces were pouring into the command center now, subduing the last pockets of resistance. He stumbled through the haze, spotting her kneeling near a console, hooking up a handheld device. Then he saw a Syndicate sniper leveling a weapon from behind a toppled pillar, aiming straight at her exposed back. "Nara!" he shouted, lunging without hesitation. The shot rang out bright and deadly, but Liam tackled her to the deck, letting the disruptor blast singe the metal overhead. Her eyes widened in surprise as they landed in a tangle of limbs. "You saved me," she breathed, the faint aroma of her presence mixed with the acrid smell of burning circuitry. He gritted his teeth, turning to see the sniper recharging the weapon for another shot. Nara wasted no time. Her top left arm grabbed Liam's baton from his belt, while her lower hands braced the floor, and with a pivoting strike she flung the baton at the sniper. It crackled on impact, and the sniper jerked, going limp. A heavy silence fell as the last of the Syndicate infiltrators were taken into custody. The battered corridor was littered with scorch marks, debris, and the groans of wounded combatants. Then came the cheers of relieved station personnel. The command center was theirs again. Slowly, Liam pushed himself up, offering Nara a hand. She took it, rising gracefully, though he still felt the tremor in her arms. She was exhausted, just like him. Their gazes locked in the swirling smoke. Words seemed unnecessary for a moment. He gave her hand a small squeeze. The rest of the security team rushed forward, confirming the infiltration was contained. A few sabotage devices remained to be disarmed, but with the station's control center reclaimed, they could systematically root out any remaining Syndicate presence. Helios Gateway, bruised but not broken, began the slow climb back to stability. As medical crews flooded the corridors, Liam and Nara found themselves swept into a wave of triage and rescue operations. Hours blurred, as though the adrenaline had morphed time into a strange haze. They worked side by side, stabilizing injured personnel, coordinating with command to lock down key areas. Finally, a lull arrived in the frantic activity, giving them a moment to breathe. They sat on a metal bench in a secluded corridor behind the command center. The overhead lights had been restored to a normal brightness. Nara leaned her head back, her silvery hair splayed against the wall. Liam, battered and sore but alive, exhaled deeply. For all the chaos, he felt a tentative peace blossoming. "You all right?" he asked, letting his gaze travel to where her arm was resting lightly on his shoulder, an intimately casual gesture for someone with 4 arms. She closed her eyes for a moment. "I'm fine, just tired." A beat. "Thank you for saving me back there." He shook his head. "You saved me too," repeatedly. A soft smile played on her lips. "I suppose we'll call it even." Her other arms fidgeted, an unaccustomed sign of her vulnerability, or maybe just exhaustion. A voice interrupted their reverie. "Commander Reeves, Dr. Terrace?" It was the station director's aide, a slight figure who approached hesitantly. "The director would like to see you both in his office." They exchanged glances. Then, with mutual effort, they rose from the bench and followed. The director's office was abuzz with the aftermath of the crisis. Officers cross-referencing logs, engineers working to restore full functionality. At the center, the elderly trill director offered them a tired smile of gratitude. "I don't know how we can ever thank you enough," he said, gesturing for them to stand in front of his desk. "You exposed the syndicate's infiltration and saved Helios Gateway from near catastrophe." Liam inclined his head, and Nara simply gave a modest nod, all four of her arms at rest now, though a slight tension remained in her posture. The director continued, "Your synergy in the field was remarkable. We all witnessed it. The manner in which you collaborated, anticipating each other's moves." He paused, eyes flicking between them. "The Alliance is forming new interspecies crisis response units to address exactly this kind of threat. We'd like you two to head one of the first teams." Liam blinked, exchanging a glance with Nara. "Me?" he said. "I'm just a security officer." "You're more than that," the director insisted. "And Dr. Terrace, your skill set goes far beyond standard medical practice." He turned a datapad on the desk toward them. "We need individuals who can adapt swiftly, cross-cultural barriers, and unify diverse talents. From what I've seen, that describes you both perfectly." Nara looked at Liam, searching his face. He understood her hesitation. She was a Lelian defector, not a standard officer, and stepping into such a prominent role could bring scrutiny. But he could also see a spark of interest. This was a chance to make a meaningful difference, to use her abilities for something bigger. He slowly nodded. "We'll do it." Nara's lips parted in a tentative smile. "Yes, I agree." The director beamed. "Wonderful. We'll formalize the details once the station is fully stabilized. For now, get some rest. You've more than earned it." As they left the office, the hum of reconstruction and controlled chaos still filled the station. Engineers replaced damaged panels, medics checked on the wounded. But there was a palpable wave of relief. Liam found himself gravitating toward one of the broad observation windows that lined the station's outer deck. The swirling vista of stars, once overshadowed by crisis, now sparkled with renewed promise. He stood there, letting the cosmic panorama calm his racing mind. Then he sensed Nara behind him. Her reflection joined his in the glass, a slender, violet figure with 4 arms, each one symbolic of the many facets of her life. She slipped one arm around his waist. "They call it binding in my culture," she said softly, as though continuing a conversation he wasn't aware they'd started. "When you can move with someone else so seamlessly, physically or emotionally. Lelians consider it a sign that 2 souls have recognized each other." He turned toward her, the starfield behind him. "We have a word for it too, but maybe not one that captures the same meaning. Something about how we fought together made me feel like I've known you so much longer than a couple of days." Her lower right hand slid along his arm, while one of the upper ones brushed a stray hair from his face. "This might sound forward, but on Lelia, that kind of bond can become a lifelong connection if both people want it." He felt his pulse quicken. A few days ago he would have thought such talk was impossible. Yet in the crucible of crisis, barriers fell. The memory of the first time he'd seen her, just a curious therapist with 4 arms, felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "Nara," he murmured, I want to see what that means." Her gaze dropped slightly, a hint of both shyness and hope. "Then perhaps we can figure it out. We'll have to be patient. There's so much to do, so many eyes on us. But the universe is a big place." He leaned closer, pressing his forehead gently to hers. "I'm not in a hurry," he whispered. "I just know that after everything we went through, I can't imagine walking away from this." They stood in silence for a long moment, the distant stars bearing witness. It was a silence laden with meaning, relief, exhaustion, gratitude, and something deeper. Eventually they drew apart, each with a half-smile that spoke of unspoken understanding. Helios Gateway would soon hum back to its regular routine, Liam and Nara had a new mission waiting, one that would officially place them at the forefront of a special response unit, and they had a personal connection that would face its own battles, bridging the gulf between species. In the following days, as the station returned to a semblance of normalcy, Liam discovered that the muscle cramp which first brought him to Nara seemed almost trivial in retrospect. A small bruise overshadowed by the revelation of the bio-tracker. But it was also the catalyst that had changed everything. Now he began to appreciate how fate or chance or whatever cosmic forces were at play had nudged him onto a path far different from the one he expected. He took the time to rest in the medbay with Nara's careful supervision, though the environment was far more crowded with injured officers. She ministered to them, moving gracefully from patient to patient. Sometimes she offered him a quick, secretive smile over a partition, a reminder that she was fully aware of his presence. Her skill and composure awed not just him, but the entire staff. Rumors spread about the four-armed doctor who fought like a special forces operative. She handled the curiosity with polite deflections, though Liam noticed some wariness lurking behind her eyes, as if she feared her past might cause trouble again. When he was cleared for active duty, the station's leadership convened a small ceremony, a gesture of thanks to those who had defended Helios Gateway. Surrounded by the patchwork of species that called the station home, Liam and Nara received official commendations. The applause felt strange to him, a man more used to the quiet respect of a job well done. But he glanced at Nara, saw the quiet pride in her expression, and realized he was happy to stand beside her in that moment. Afterward, they slipped away from the gathering, seeking a quieter corner. They wandered along a promenade that overlooked a hydroponic garden. The artificial sunlight cast interesting shadows on the leaves of alien plants. He asked her about Lelia, and she painted a picture of a world where architecture wound seamlessly between living forests of luminous vines, and family structures revolved around intricate ceremonies of closeness. She admitted she missed some of it, but she had chosen to leave rather than support a government she believed was on the cusp of unethical militaristic expansions. "I see," he said softly, "and you found your way here, working as a therapist to do something healing after the secrets you once kept." She shrugged with two of her arms while another gently brushed a glimmering leaf near them. "In a sense, yes. I was searching for redemption, or at least a place where I could utilize my skills without betraying my conscience." A faraway look entered her eyes. "But I'm not naive. There are always lines to be crossed in war. The Orion Syndicate isn't the only threat in the galaxy. My own government has plans I can't condone. And I suspect your Earth fleet has its skeletons too." He nodded. "It does. Every empire, every alliance, they all have shadows. All we can do is keep pushing for something better." She smiled faintly. "That's why I find you humans so refreshing. You're not afraid to be direct about your flaws, and you cling to hope, sometimes recklessly, but often courageously." He touched her hand. "We might be different species, but that hope is in both of us, I think." They continued along the promenade, content in each other's company. Eventually, the conversation drifted to more immediate concerns, like forming the new Interspecies Crisis Response Unit. The station director, along with higher-ups in the Alliance, wanted them to assemble a team capable of rapid deployment to hotspots. It was an opportunity to do real good, to prevent scenarios like Helios Gateway from repeating. Yet it also meant stepping into a more public role, which might expose them to political scrutiny. One evening, about a week after the Syndicate infiltration, Nara finished her last shift in the medbay and joined Liam in the small cabin he had been assigned. They settled onto a bench by the viewport, sipping a mild tea gleaned from some Andorian recipe. The faint starlight outside lent a softness to the moment. She reached for his hand, her violet fingers interlacing with his. "Liam, there's something about our bond that's recognized on Lelia. It's not a formal ceremony, not like a wedding in human terms, but it's significant. Binding, we call it, as I mentioned. If we were on my homeworld after fighting side by side and sharing each other's burdens, we'd be considered bound in spirit." His heart beat a little faster. "That sounds almost like marriage." She shrugged her upper shoulders. In some ways, yes, though it doesn't necessarily involve all the same legalities. It's more of a cultural recognition, an acknowledgement that the souls have moved in sync. He studied her face, searching for any hint of doubt. And how do you feel about that? Are you comfortable with it here among humans? She took a breath, glancing out at the drifting stars. I don't know if my people would approve, but that's why I left. I wanted to find my own path, and the bond we share, it feels real. It means something to me. He squeezed her hand gently. Then let it mean something to us. You've seen the best and worst of me already in such a short time. His voice caught slightly, an emotional tremor that surprised even him. I never expected any of this. She turned to him fully, one of her hands cupping his cheek. Neither did I. But the universe has a way of surprising us. He leaned in and their lips brushed softly. It was not the desperate meeting of two people in the throes of crisis, but rather a quiet affirmation of what had grown between them. She deepened the kiss, and for a moment all the stress of the station, the syndicate, the future fell away. There was just the hum of life support in the background, the faint glow of stars, and the warmth of two souls who had found each other against all odds. That night they remained close, talking quietly, planning for tomorrow, for the day after that, for the many duties that awaited them. As dawn's cycle lit the corridor, they prepared to meet the station leadership again. The new unit needed structure, protocols, personnel rosters. The remnants of the Orion Syndicate infiltration needed to be addressed. And somewhere in the midst of all that, they had to figure out how to navigate a bond that crossed the boundaries of species, cultures, and histories. Still, Liam's mind drifted back to the initial reason he had walked into Dr. Terrace's office, a pesky, relentless muscle cramp. He gave a wry smile, realizing how that small complaint had unfolded into a galaxy-turning event. The randomness of life sometimes led to the most profound connections. By the end of the week, Helios Gateway was more or less functional again. Civilian life resumed, shops reopened, trade ships docked. The station's administrators released a formal statement praising the heroic efforts of Commander Liam Reeves and Dr. Nara Terrace, who had uncovered the infiltration and played a pivotal role in its defeat. Many on the station whispered about the rumor that the human officer and the four-armed Lilian were more than just colleagues, but the rumors were mostly kind, as far as Liam could tell. He was standing in the station's docking area near a sleek Earth Fleet corvette that had just arrived to ferry in fresh supplies. Nara was beside him, signing off on a crate of specialized medical equipment for the new unit. They'd just been informed that the official name of their team would be the Interstellar Crisis Task Force, a bland moniker typical of bureaucratic naming. Nonetheless, the director had insisted that Liam and Nara would be co-commanders, with authority to request cross-species specialists from across the Alliance. As the last crate was hauled away, Liam turned to her. We'll be leaving Helios Gateway soon, traveling to different hotspots and diplomatic outposts. How do you feel about that? She exhaled softly. Nervous. Excited. I've spent so long in hiding, content to be a quiet therapist, but I can't deny that I'm needed out there, and that we can do real good. He nodded, stepping closer so they could speak without being overheard. I'm glad we're doing it together, because the thought of going out there alone... He shook his head, remembering how isolated he'd felt prior to meeting her. She reached up with one of her hands to rest lightly on his shoulder while another brushed the side of his face. We're bound now, Liam. Whether in the quiet corners of this station or out in the middle of a cosmic battlefield, we face it together. He felt that same surge of emotion he'd come to associate with her, an odd mixture of confidence and tenderness. They paused, letting the gravity of her words settle. The docking bay was filled with the chatter of cargo drones and technicians. But in that moment, they might as well have been alone under a starry sky. At length, the station director arrived, offering them official data pads that outlined their new duties. He gave a fatherly grin. I'm proud to see how well you two have adapted. Earthfleet can be rigid, Lilian customs can be strict, but you've shown us a glimpse of what true cooperation can accomplish. Liam accepted the datapad. "Thank you, sir. We won't let you down." Nara mirrored his sentiment with a polite inclination of her head, her violet complexion glowing in the overhead lights. "We appreciate the trust, and we'll do our best to maintain the station's safety even while operating abroad." "Of that I have no doubt," the director replied. They watched him walk away, then exchanged smiles. There was a swirl of possibility in the air, a sense that the real journey was only beginning. Sure, Helios Gateway had been saved, but the galaxy was vast, and threats like the Orion Syndicate were just one of many that lurked in the shadows. Still, as they made their way down the docking concourse, Liam felt a steady warmth in his chest. He remembered how he'd shown up at the medical bay in desperate need of relief from a stabbing muscle cramp, half in a foul mood and half in denial that he needed outside help. If anyone had told him then that within a handful of days he would not only uncover a syndicate plot, but also find himself bound in spirit to an alien defector with 4 arms, he would have laughed them away. Yet here he was, more at peace than he'd been in a long time. Nara's arm brushed against his side, and she turned to him with a hint of mischief in her smile. "So, do you still have any pain in that shoulder?" He flexed experimentally, rotating his arm. There was just a ghost of discomfort that lingered. "It's much better, actually. Must be your magic touch." She playfully raised an eyebrow. "4 arms can do wonders, you know." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Yes, I've noticed." Their eyes locked, and for a moment, the rest of the station's hustle faded, replaced by a private bubble of shared intimacy. They strolled onward, rejoining the main corridors, fielding questions from newly arrived Earthfleet officers who wanted quick statements on the infiltration fiasco. All the while, Liam marveled that something so mundane, a muscle cramp, could have led to this entire chain of events. Life was unpredictable, especially in the far reaches of space. Later, as day cycle approached and the station's artificial lighting brightened, Liam found himself and Nara in the observation deck once again. Repair ships drifted outside, welding plating over areas that had been damaged in the fight. The entire station seemed to exhale with relief. On the deck, a few officers and civilians walked around, some gazing at the cosmos, others deep in conversation. He and Nara stood at the edge of the transparent viewport. She pressed one of her hands against the glass, her expression contemplative. He studied her profile, the gentle slope of her nose, the subtle arch of her brow, the set of her violet lips. He traced his gaze along the arms that had been so instrumental in both healing him and fighting at his side. "You're staring," she said softly, though there was no reproach in her tone. "I'm allowed," he teased gently. Then his voice turned serious. "I just keep thinking about how different things might have been. If the syndicate never attacked, if you weren't here, if I hadn't gone to your treatment bay." "It's surreal." She nodded, the reflection of stars shimmering in her silvery hair. "Fate, coincidence, destiny, call it what you will. All I know is that I wouldn't trade it, even if it was terrifying at times." He slid an arm around her waist. The station's overhead lights dimmed in that section, simulating a more peaceful cycle for those wanting to stargaze. A hush fell, as though encouraging them to speak in whispers. Nara turned to him, her gaze gentle yet intense. "On Lelia, the final step of binding involves traveling to a sacred place, exchanging tokens, and weaving a cloth around 2 of the partner's arms. It's meant to symbolize unity and interdependence. Without that ceremony, it's not recognized officially, but it's recognized in the hearts of the 2 who share it." He brushed her hair aside, letting his fingers graze her cheek. "I guess we'll have to find our own version, something that fits both of us." He hesitated, vulnerability slipping into his voice. "I can't claim to know what the future holds. This job, this life, it's dangerous. You've seen it firsthand." She smiled, a soft, radiant glow crossing her features. "I've seen it. I'm not afraid." One of her hands came up to rest over his heart. "I also know I can't ever pretend to be just a harmless therapist again. I'd rather fight for something I believe in, with you, if you'll have me." He pulled her closer. All in the hush of the observation deck, they kissed, a sweet, lingering contact that whispered of promises and possibilities uncharted. Stars burned on the other side of the transparent wall, an endless tapestry of mysteries awaiting them. When they finally parted, neither needed to say anything more. The moment was sealed, the future wide open. As they gazed out at the infinite expanse, the memory of the first day they'd met circled back in Liam's mind. The muscle cramp that had driven him to her doorstep, the 4 arms that had stunned him, the quiet realization that sometimes the smallest twist of fate could trigger events that shaped the galaxy and hearts in ways no one would anticipate. And so, with Helios Gateway safe for the time being, with the Orion Syndicate temporarily thwarted, and with an unspoken bond forming between a human security officer and a 4-armed Lelian defector, their story entered a new chapter. In the silent swirl of stars, they found a spark of hope that might one day illuminate even the darkest corners of space.